You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So for those of you who've been listening to the podcast, who've subscribed, thank you very much. Really appreciate the company, and at some point maybe I will hear from you. Let me just recap a little bit from the last episode. So essentially what we've been talking about is taking a bit of a deep dive into the criticisms of evolutionary psychology, because the patriarchs are using a lot of the sort of ideas out of evolutionary psychology to substantiate their position. I'm not saying that evolutionary psychologists necessarily do that, but certainly some of the fanboys and, including Jordan Peterson, seems to rely a lot on the interpretations of what evolutionary psychology purports to find with respect to human behaviour. Now, in this particular episode, I'm actually going to focus on the idea of aggression and violence. This, I think and believe, under the circumstances in which we are geopolitically, it's a really important place to delve into and to get an understanding of what we're really talking about. So let's do a deep dive into aggression. And why are we talking about it? Well, let me, as I said, put up front, we're talking about it because right now, aggression and violence seems to be at an epidemic level in all sorts of places where you'd often least expect it. So let me start with aggression, okay? And the reason why I'm going to start with aggression, because I think this sort of behaviour is on a spectrum, and it goes from being frustrated to angry, aggression, rage, and violence. Okay, but I'm going to focus specifically in this podcast on aggression and violence. So what are we talking about in psychology when we use that term aggression? Well, it refers essentially to a range of behaviours that can result in both physical and psychological harm to yourself, others, or objects in the environment. So yes, when your partner throws a dinner plate across the room, that is fundamentally aggression with violence. And it's not just because I'm angry, dear. While most of us at some point or another feel some form of aggression, but when aggression becomes pervasive or extreme, it might mean that there's a deep situated underlying problem. Okay, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So let's talk a little bit about signs of aggression. Because aggressive behaviour is intended to harm someone who doesn't want to be harmed, it has to involve action. So this is the link between now aggression and violence. So aggression is the emotional reaction, violence is the action that results. So simply thinking about doing someone harm, like my my fantasy when someone cuts me off in traffic that I'm going to launch an Exocet missile into their car, is actually doesn't cut it. Okay, it's not really aggression. It's not really violence. Aggressive behaviours, as I said, can be physical, and this is where we now talk about violence. But aggression is also verbal, and verbal aggression can also be violent in a sense, especially when it's accompanied by, certain body language and volume of voice. The other sign of aggression that we talk about is what's called relational, which is intended to harm another person's relationship. So, for example, this can include spreading rumors or lying about somebody. So, the character assassination is a good example of that. We also need to look at types of aggression. Okay, and as a psychologist, most of us are trained to divide aggression into two main types. There's the impulsive aggression, which is essentially a reactive form, and is also often accompanied by other strong emotions. It's not planned, and it often takes place in the heat of the moment. So one of the examples that's come up in the Goetz article is about someone spilling a drink on you, okay? And it's in that context that a person who has difficulty regulating their emotions might lash out impulsively and then most of the time later on regret it, okay? The other one is what's called instrumental aggression, which is also in some circles known as predatory aggression. And it's essentially there to achieve a larger goal. It's carefully planned and it exists as a means to an end. So, in the big picture, Russia acting aggressively and violently towards the Ukraine. It could also be happening between a bully and his victim in the playground. Okay, so it's particularly important to understand the difference. So hurting a person in a crime is often related to this type of aggression as well. Now, the big question that comes up, and this is where evolutionary psychology is also particularly relevant, and we need to be careful about how we interpret this stuff, is we need to talk about what causes aggression. Now, I'm going to put it right up front. I think most human beings, male, female, or whatever persuasion you are, has the potential towards aggression and violence. And generally speaking, we can identify around 5 particular causes. The first one is neurological, and the thing that comes to mind here is a situation where someone has an acquired brain injury and they've lost the capacity or they've reduced their capacity to regulate their feelings. And in some respects, that may result in domestic violence. This is a common one. In fact, the statistics in domestic violence and acquired brain injury are quite strong. So I can't remember the exact number now, but I think it was over 50%. The other one is childhood trauma, where, again, the person's capacity to regulate their emotions has been impaired. They've been psychologically injured. PTSD is another one that comes to mind in this sort of situation. The other particular one that I really need to bring up, because this is what I see often in couples or as a member of a couple, is where there's a personality disorder, especially borderline personality disorder or the narcissistic personality disorder. Now, the fifth factor is that it is not unusual for me to work with someone who has a tendency to internalize, repress, or suppress anger. And at some point, something triggers that rush of all that repressed emotional energy to come out violently. Okay? So those things are generally considered to be the causes of aggression. Okay, so as we talked about, violence is the action. So how does evolutionary psychology view violence? Well, as we talked about, according to the mainstream in evolutionary psychology, human biological evolution and its selection is indifferent to morals. Now, I've thought a lot about this, and I actually have some problems with that particular observation because I do not believe that evolution is amoral in a sense. It can be seen to be directed towards the better good of the species in a sense. Um, but the evolutionary psychologists will argue that it will produce pro-social and antisocial adaptations for survival and reproduction. Again, let me pose this. Well, if it's antisocial and the group actually helps the individual organism to survive, surely that would reduce an evolutionary advantage. So, if biologically, me being violent um, gives me an evolutionary edge, I'm not quite sure how that will work because at some point or another, uh, someone's going to take objection to my violence and basically edit me out of the gene pool. So, the other thing that we can need to consider in that context is what about psychological factors, as I talked about? Um, if evolutionary psychology focuses on the outcome being reproduction, um, my capacity to reproduce, if I'm overly violent, is going to be curtailed. Someone else in the group is going to stop me. Okay. The other point that I want to make is that certainly with some of the mammals that have been studied, including primates and monkeys, we do tend to see um, moral behavior, the capacity to share, to feel for a member of my group. There's often the reference to chimpanzees and how violent they are and how strategic they are. There's several criticisms of that, and that is that usually we can see some form of decontamination. So if it's strategic fighting or violence to get food resources, then the problem that we've got there is that why is there a problem with the food resource? Is it a natural problem, or is it something that's been introduced by somebody else, like someone doing an experiment where we artificially feeding or putting out food to the group to bring them closer so that they can be studied? There's a whole bunch of stuff involved in explaining that, and I don't really have this sort of bandwidth to get into that too much at the moment. So when evolutionary psychologists argue that violence is innate, we need to be extremely careful about that. The idea that because skeletons show evidence of violent, purposeful injuries inflicted by other human beings, well, does it? Or is it simply that there is archaeological evidence that some humans were hurt or killed by other humans, or possibly even other animals, unless we have cut marks and so on? Okay, another story. But we don't actually have any idea about the distribution of that violence, the frequency of that violence, and the impact of that violence on possibly other archaeological finds. So, taking such a small sample and then extrapolating from that sample with such a broad statement, I think is extremely flawed. The other one was about hunter-gatherer societies, and I spoke about that one in the last podcast as well. And again, here I come up with the idea that we can't take modern-day hunter-gatherers as an example of the Neolithic or Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, because no human being fundamentally has been untouched or uncontaminated by modern man, by the modern Homo sapien. And so it really doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the evolutionary process. So we do need to be exceptionally careful. As I keep bringing this up, because people keep pulling stuff out going, yes, but this is what it says. Now, this is what we're inferring. So inductive reasoning becomes the cornerstone in a lot of evolutionary psychological argument. So Aaron Goetz also discusses that previous research documents that the majority of homicides occur between unrelated men over threats to status. Arguments escalate between young, unemployed, unmarried men in which an individual challenges or undermines the status of another. Well, there's a huge number of possible explanations for that sort of scenario. The description of that in of itself gives us a significant clue that most of these men would suffer from some form of psychopathology, trauma, and impulse control deficits. So, how does that tell us anything about the evolutionary process? What it does tell us is about this particular group of human beings that we're looking at. So, mainstream evolutionary psychology then proposes that the male psychological mechanism to become violent in response to threats of status was positively selected during our ancient past due to sexual selection. In other words, it's assumed that ancient women chose to have sex with men with high status, thereby selecting the male genetic determinants of the motivation to fight someone who threatens one's status. Well, I could raise a whole range of criticisms around that. Well, firstly, modern human women, and I would assume women of the past, do not necessarily choose on status, right? And also, what status are we talking about? If I go back into the Neolithic or Paleolithic, there would be certain conditions that would give me more status in my family or tribe than what it means today. So the actual definition of status is subjective. So, is it that men's beauty, gee, he's got a great ass, therefore I have an irresistible urge to have sex with him? Or is status that size matters? I.e., I don't date anyone shorter than me. So anyone who was thinking about something different falls on you. Or is it wealth? Before I go to bed, I need to see your investment portfolio just to make sure that I'm with the right status male. So this whole idea about attraction based on wealth is especially tricky. How many women have gotten into a relationship believing he was wealthy only to find out that he was strapped? And finally, when women go for the supposed alpha male, they often discover to their horror, and I stretch that word and particularly emphasize it, that what she thought of as being a strong male was in fact a man with emotional immaturity who has a predisposition to aggression and violence because of his own insecurities. So it's not actually a high status. The best you could say is that he's just an asshole. And if you want to use the argument of the best provider, then that's even more situationally and culturally specific, as well as chronologically. In our technological society, for instance, one of the more financially successful people, or a lot of the financially successful people, are what you might define as nerds. Take a look at Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, Bezos. None of these guys are, physically built. They try. Obviously, some of them work out. Bezos, in particular, seems to be in the gym a lot, from what you can tell from his photos. But they are not the traditional idea, the traditional masculine idea of an alpha male. They certainly don't look like or have the presence of someone like Schwarzenegger. So some of you might be asking, why is this relevant to understanding patriarchy? Well, my answer to this is very simple. Patriarchy and the submission of women took place through the belief in the exceptionalism of men. Basically, we bought the pill that we're better by nature than women, and then there is a pecking order. And in evolutionary psychology, although it mightn't intentionally support this myth, it unfortunately gives many the hope to perpetuate this. But here's one more point to consider. Although our brain is structurally no different to our ancestors in the Neolithic, Our society and culture has shaped it in a way that our ancestors had never experienced. And this has a profound impact on behaviour. And if we try to hang on to our Neolithic past and the cultural behaviours attached to that, we're in worse strife than what we might think. So until next time, I hope that's given you some thought on being critical about the stories science tells us.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.